stood frozen in the gilded ballroom, the air thick with the scent of expensive champagne and designer perfume that seemed to choke me. The crystal chandeliers above cast a bright, mocking light over the crowd of socialites who had once called me a friend. In the center of the room, my ex-husband Lennox raised his glass high, his face glowing with a pride he never showed when we were together. Beside him stood Isolde, the millionaire heiress he had shamelessly used to replace me. She was draped in diamonds that sparkled like ice, her arm linked tightly through his, as if marking her territory. The guests clapped and cheered, their applause sounding like thunder in my ears. I wasn't even allowed near the head table. I had been relegated to a corner, forced to witness my own erasure as a mere guest at an event that celebrated my humiliation. My name is Imrin, and in that moment, I realized that Lennox didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to prove that I was nothing without him. Every word he spoke to Isolde, every laugh they shared, cut deeper than any knife. The family I thought I belonged to, for years, was now applauding the woman who had stepped into my shoes before they were even cold. I watched as Lennox leaned in to whisper something in Isolde's ear, making her giggle. It was a calculated display of affection designed to show the world how much better he was doing now. I felt a wave of heat rise to my face, but I didn't turn away. I forced myself to look, to memorize the way they sneered when our eyes met for a brief second. They thought I was a broken woman, a discarded relic of Lennox's past. But as the champagne flowed and the music swelled, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. The pain didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, a silent, burning vow. I realized that the only way to reclaim my power was to play their game, but I would play it on my terms. I would not cry, and I would not beg. I would dismantle the life they had built at my expense without losing my dignity. As I took a slow sip of my drink, I realized the ballroom wasn't just a place of humiliation. It was a scouting ground. I began to look at the room differently, not as a victim, but as a strategist. The war had started, and Lennox had no idea that I was already planning my first move. The memories of my marriage to Lennox began to flood back, each one a sharp reminder of why I was standing in this corner today. I remembered the day it all ended, the day Lennox looked at me with eyes as cold as stone and told me, "You're not enough." We had been married for years, and I had given him everything, my loyalty, my support, and my youth. I had stayed quiet while he built his ego, and I had tolerated his family's subtle jabs to keep the peace. But none of that mattered once Isolde and her millions entered the picture. Lennox hadn't just left me. He had traded me in like an old car for a newer, shinier model. He didn't care about the years of history we shared or the sacrifices I had made. To him, I was a placeholder until someone with a bigger bank account came along. My heart had shattered that day, but sitting here now, watching him flaunt his new life, my mind began to sharpen. I realized that my mistake had been my kindness. I had been too easy to walk over because I never fought back. I thought about the sneers from his mother and the manipulations from his friends that I had endured. They had always treated me like an outsider, a girl from a modest background who should be grateful just to be in the same room as them. Lennox had promised to protect me, but instead, he was the one who threw me to the wolves. I promised myself right then that one day, they would all see the true cost of underestimating me. The betrayal ran deep, but it provided me with a strange kind of freedom. Since I had already lost everything, I had nothing left to fear. While Lennox was busy trying to impress the elite with his new heiress, I began to think about his vulnerabilities. I knew his secrets, his insecurities, and exactly how much he relied on his family's image. He thought he was untouchable now that he was with Isolde, but he had forgotten one thing. I knew the man behind the mask, and I knew exactly how to make that mask slip. I decided to stay at the event longer than I originally planned. Instead of hiding in the shadows, I began to circulate, acting as the quiet, harmless guest that no one bothered to notice. I realized that in this world, people like me were invisible to people like them, and that invisibility was my greatest weapon. I started to study the room with the eyes of a hunter. I watched Dorian, Lennox's father and the patriarch of the family empire. He was an elegant, shrewd man who sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding respect, even without him saying a word. Dorian didn't join in the loud, boisterous laughing of the younger crowd. He watched his son with a look that wasn't exactly pride. It was more like indulgence, the way one watches a spoiled child. I made a mental note of that. Then I turned my attention to Lennox. He was drinking too much, his arrogance growing with every glass. He was making grand promises to Isolde's father, trying so hard to prove he belonged in her league. He was sloppy, and he was loud. I also watched the household staff, the people who actually kept this massive machine running. They moved like ghosts, refilling glasses and clearing plates while the guests ignored them. I saw the way a server winced when Lennox made a rude comment, and I saw the resentment in the eyes of the head housekeeper as she organized the chaos. These people were the keepers of secrets. They heard the whispered arguments in the hallways and saw the financial documents left on mahogany desks. Every glance and every whisper I captured became ammunition for my plan. I began to see the cracks in the family's foundation. Lennox's lifestyle was funded entirely by his allowance from Dorian, and he was spending it faster than ever to keep up with Isolde. The empire was strong, but the people inside it were divided. I realized that if I wanted to dismantle Lennox's life, I didn't need to attack him directly. I just needed to pull the right strings from the shadows. A few days after the party, I found myself back near the family estate, supposedly to pick up some final personal items. As I was leaving the side entrance, I ran into Sable, the head housekeeper. She had worked for the family for 20 years and had always been kind to me, even when the rest of the family was cold. I stopped to thank her for everything she had done during my time there. Sable looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then she quietly slid a small, folded note into my hand. "I never see the helpers, Imrin," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "But we see everything." I tucked the note into my pocket and nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. When I got to my car, I opened the note. It contained a list of dates and a name, a private accountant the family used for their unofficial business. Sable had become my first secret informant. She had seen how Lennox treated me, and she clearly had no loyalty to a man who treated his staff like furniture. Sable began to provide me with the kind of information money couldn't buy. She told me about the hidden bank accounts Lennox used to hide his gambling debts from his father. She told me about the strings Dorian used to control Lennox's allowance and how precarious Lennox's financial situation actually was. He was living a life of luxury on a borrowed dime, and Dorian was the only thing keeping him afloat. Knowing this changed everything. Lennox wasn't the powerful man he pretended to be. He was a puppet. Isolde only saw the flashy cars and the designer suits, but she didn't know that it could all be taken away with a single signature from Dorian. With Sable's help, I began to map out the intricate finances of the family empire. I was no longer just a heartbroken ex-wife. I was a woman with a roadmap to her enemy's destruction. The underdog was starting to find her bite. Isolde was everywhere. She made sure of it. Every social media post, every local news segment about the elite featured her and Lennox. She flaunted her new gifts, her expensive jewels, and the endless stream of money she spent as if it were water. To the outside world, she was the perfect millionaire heiress, the woman who had finally given Lennox the status he deserved. But I saw through it. She was arrogant and shallow. Unaware that I was learning exactly how to dismantle the family empire, she was so eager to join. I watched a video of her laughing at a charity event, her hand resting on Lennox's arm. She made a joke about people who don't belong in high society, and Lennox laughed right along with her. Every cruel laugh she shared with him only fueled my strategy. They were so confident in their superiority that they didn't even think I was a threat. To them, I was gone, a memory they had already deleted. But their arrogance was their biggest weakness. Isolde was so focused on showing off that she didn't notice the tension she was creating within the family. Dorian, I learned through Sable, wasn't fond of her loud personality or the way she encouraged Lennox to spend money like it was going out of style. Isolde was a disruptor, and in a family that valued tradition and quiet power, she was becoming a nuisance. I studied the way she handled herself. She was impulsive and easily provoked. If I could lean into that, I could make her look like a liability instead of an asset. While she was busy picking out wedding venues and ordering custom gowns, I was studying the legal structure of the family's trusts. I was learning the language of their business, the things Lennox had never bothered to teach me because he thought I wasn't smart enough to understand them. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The opportunity to test my new knowledge came sooner than I expected. There was a small, private dinner for some of the family's close associates, and through a connection I had made with a distant family member, I managed to get an invitation. I knew my presence would irritate Lennox, but that was the point. I arrived looking polished but modest, the complete opposite of Isolde's over-the-top glamour. During the dinner, I stayed quiet, observing the dynamics. Lennox was already on his third glass of wine, his face flushed. He kept trying to dominate the conversation, bragging about a new investment he was making. I knew, thanks to Sable's information, that the investment was a disaster waiting to happen. At one point, I intentionally leaned forward to reach for the water and accidentally tipped my glass, spilling a bit of red wine near Lennox's expensive silk sleeve. It was a small thing, but Lennox exploded. "Watch what you're doing! Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" he hissed, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation. The table went silent. Dorian looked over, his eyebrows knit together in disapproval. I immediately apologized with a soft, trembling voice, playing the role of the intimidated ex-wife perfectly. Lennox's fury gave me exactly the insight I needed. Panic made him careless. He was so on edge about his image and his money that even a small spill made him lose his mask of sophistication. Sable's whispers were confirmed. He was a ticking time bomb of insecurity. He hadn't seen my move coming, and he certainly didn't realize that I had just shown his father exactly how unhinged he could be over nothing. I had successfully tested the waters, and now I knew exactly how to push his buttons. After the dinner, my focus shifted. While Lennox was the target of my revenge, I realized that Dorian was the key to the entire kingdom. I began to study him with the same intensity I had used on Lennox, but with a different goal. Dorian was the patriarch, elegant, shrewd, and as I began to notice, surprisingly lonely. He was surrounded by people who wanted something from him, including his own son. Lennox treated Dorian like a bank, always hovering and waiting for the next handout. I started to see Dorian not just as the man who held the purse strings, but as a person who was tired of the shallow games his family played. He valued loyalty and intelligence, two things Lennox and Isolde lacked. I realized that marrying Dorian wasn't just a path to revenge. It was an opportunity to secure real power. If I could position myself by his side, I wouldn't just be the ex-wife anymore. I would be the woman who controlled Lennox's future. I began to attend the same galleries and charity functions that Dorian frequented. I made sure to stay in his peripheral vision, never approaching him directly at first. I wanted him to notice me on his own terms. When we finally did speak, I didn't talk about Lennox or the divorce. Instead, I spoke about art, business, and the history of the city, topics I knew he enjoyed. I could see the surprise in his eyes. He had spent years seeing me through Lennox's lens as a quiet, unremarkable girl. Now, he was seeing a woman who was composed, knowledgeable, and genuinely interested in the things he cared about. I wasn't stooping to Lennox's level of petty insults. I was playing a much higher game. I was becoming someone Dorian could trust, and in his world, trust was the rarest commodity of all. It was time for the first subtle strike. Using the information Sable had gathered, I found a minor but embarrassing financial error in one of the family's smaller subsidiary companies, one that Lennox was supposed to be overseeing as a test from his father. It wasn't enough to ruin the company, but it was enough to make Lennox look incompetent. I didn't go to Dorian with it. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I leaked it to the family's main accountant, a man I knew was a stickler for perfection. The fallout was immediate but quiet, just the way I wanted it. Lennox began to panic. He didn't know how the error had been found or who had flagged it, but he knew his father was furious. He started obsessing over his accounts, his paranoia growing. He was already worried about his allowance, and this mistake made him look like he couldn't handle even the smallest amount of responsibility. I watched from a distance as Lennox's mood soured. He became more aggressive with Isolde, and she, in turn, became more demanding. They were starting to crack under the pressure of their own vanity. Lennox had no idea that I was the one orchestrating the tension. He still thought I was somewhere feeling sorry for myself, unaware that I was the ghost in his machine. This strike was important because it started the process of eroding Dorian's trust in his son. Dorian had always suspected Lennox was lazy, but now he had proof of his carelessness. Every time Lennox stumbled, it made me look better by comparison. I was the one who remained calm, the one who was moving on with grace, while Lennox was the one falling apart over a simple clerical error. The foundation was being laid, brick by brick. The next step required a bold move. There was a high-profile gala coming up, the kind of event where the entire city's elite would be present. I knew Lennox and Isolde would be there, ready to show off their engagement. I decided to attend as well, but not as the pitiful ex. I contacted a business associate of Dorian's I had met recently and arranged to attend as his guest, posing as a distant acquaintance who was interested in the family's philanthropic work. When I walked into the gala, I saw Lennox's face turn pale. He was standing with Isolde, who was wearing a dress that cost more than most people's houses. Lennox sneered when he saw me, clearly annoyed that I had invaded his space again. He tried to make a snide comment as I walked past, but I didn't even look at him. I headed straight for the VIP section where Dorian was holding court. I spent the evening in Dorian's circle. I was charming, witty, and perfectly poised. I could feel Lennox's eyes on me from across the room, burning with confusion and anger. He couldn't understand how I was in the same room as his father's most trusted allies. He didn't realize that this was my first public step into reclaiming my power. By the end of the night, I had successfully cemented my presence in Dorian's world. People were starting to ask who I was, and Dorian himself seemed pleased by my company. He even invited me to join him for a private viewing of a new art collection the following week. As I left the gala, I caught one last glimpse of Lennox. He looked small, standing there in his expensive suit, while I felt like I was finally standing tall. The tables were slowly, but surely, beginning to turn. Sable continued to be my eyes and ears inside the house. A few days after the gala, she shared a conversation she had overheard between Isolde and her friends. Isolde was apparently fuming that I had been at the gala, and more importantly, that Dorian had spent so much time talking to me. She was insecure about the fact that Dorian seemed to favor my company over hers. She knew that if she wanted to truly be part of the family, she needed Dorian's approval, and she wasn't getting it. I smiled when I heard this. Jealousy is a powerful tool, and Isolde was the perfect person to use it against. She was the type of woman who would lash out when she felt threatened, and I wanted her to feel as threatened as possible. If she started acting out because of me, it would only drive a deeper wedge between Lennox's new life and his father's expectations. I began to use this to my advantage. I would send small, polite notes to Dorian, thanking him for his advice or mentioning an article I thought he'd find interesting. I knew these notes would be seen by the household staff and eventually reported back to Isolde. I was planting seeds of doubt and competition without ever having to say a word to her. The tension in the house was rising. Lennox was caught in the middle, trying to keep Isolde happy while also trying to regain his father's favor. He was exhausted and irritable, which made him even more prone to making mistakes. My plan was working perfectly. I was becoming a constant, silent presence in their lives, a shadow they couldn't shake. I was no longer the one being erased. I was the one doing the erasing. I decided to turn up the heat. I knew Lennox had been mismanaging some of the investment funds he had been given, relying on his name rather than actual strategy to get by. I subtly hinted to some of the family's long-term financial advisors that there were inconsistencies in the reports Lennox was submitting. I didn't make direct accusations. I just asked innocent questions that forced the advisors to look closer. As the advisors began to dig, the tension in the family office grew. Lennox was called into several private meetings with his father, and according to Sable, the shouting could be heard from the hallway. My presence was becoming impossible for the family to ignore. I was no longer just the ex-wife who had vanished. I was the person whose name kept coming up in connection with the very things Lennox was failing at. Lennox tried to deflect the blame, but he didn't have the evidence to back it up. He began to suspect that someone was out to get him, but he couldn't figure out who. He still didn't think I had the brains for such a move. He blamed the advisors, the market, and even Isolde's distractions. His lack of accountability only made Dorian more disappointed. I watched the chaos unfold with a calm satisfaction. I was playing a long game, and every move was designed to isolate Lennox. By making him look incompetent in front of the family advisors, I was cutting off his support system from the inside. He was becoming a liability to the family name, and in Dorian's world, a liability was something that needed to be managed or removed. While Lennox was spiraling, I focused on strengthening my bond with Dorian. I knew that if I wanted to become the matriarch, I had to show him that I wasn't just smart, but loyal, something he felt his own son wasn't. I began to share more of my own background, my passion for the family's heritage, and my ideas for their future philanthropic efforts. I used charm and a calculated bit of vulnerability to draw him in. I told him how much I had always respected the way he built the empire, and how I had felt sidelined during my marriage to Lennox, because I wanted to contribute more than just being a trophy. Dorian listened with an intensity I hadn't expected. He admitted that he had often felt the same way, that people only saw his wealth and not the work behind it. We were finding common ground in our shared sense of being misunderstood. Of course, I was carefully concealing my true plan. While I did respect Dorian's achievements, my ultimate goal was still to position myself as the rightful matriarch so I could have the power to deal with Lennox once and for all. I was becoming the confidant Dorian never had. He began to ask for my opinion on minor business matters, and I made sure my advice was always sound and beneficial to him. Lennox was starting to notice our growing closeness, and it made him paranoid. He tried to warn Dorian about me, but his warnings sounded like the ramblings of a jealous child. Dorian brushed him off, telling him he should be more concerned with his own failing projects. I had successfully positioned myself as the reliable one in Dorian's eyes, while his own son was becoming the problem. One afternoon, while I was visiting Dorian at the family estate, I happened to be left alone in his study for a few minutes while he took a call. I didn't waste the opportunity. I quickly scanned some of the documents on his desk and found a folder labeled with Lennox's name. Inside were old contracts and trust documents that revealed the truth about Lennox's lifestyle. He was entirely a puppet. The documents showed that Lennox had no actual ownership of the family assets. Everything he had, the cars, the penthouse, the credit cards, was part of a strictly controlled allowance that Dorian could revoke at any time. Lennox had been living a lie, pretending to be a powerful businessman when he was really just a child on a very long leash. He had been using this fake wealth to impress Isolde and keep her around. This knowledge was the ultimate leverage. If Isolde found out that Lennox was essentially penniless without his father's permission, her love for him would likely evaporate. And if Dorian realized how much Lennox was lying to his future wife about his status, it would be another mark against his character. I began to craft a way to use this information to deliver the final blow. I realized that Lennox's biggest fear wasn't losing me, it was losing his money and the status that came with it. He had traded me for a millionaire heiress because he thought it would make him even more powerful, but he had actually made himself more vulnerable. He was a man built on sand, and I was about to bring the tide in. Dorian's birthday was approaching, and the family was planning a large, formal dinner. I knew this was the perfect stage for my next move. I orchestrated a small incident that I knew would set Lennox off. I arranged for a specific piece of news, a rumor about one of Lennox's failed investments being leaked to a local business journalist, to reach Lennox's ears just an hour before the dinner. As I expected, Lennox arrived at the dinner already fuming. He was drinking heavily to calm his nerves, but it only made him more volatile. During the toasts, I leaned over and whispered something to the person next to me, just loud enough for Lennox to hear. "It's a shame about that investment leak. I hope Dorian hasn't seen it yet." Lennox snapped. He stood up, his face red, and began a loud, rambling defense of his business skills, accusing the vultures in the room of trying to tear him down. He even pointed a finger at me, calling me a bitter ex-wife who was trying to poison his father against him. The room went dead silent. The guests gasped, shocked by his lack of decorum at his father's birthday celebration. Dorian didn't say a word. He just looked at his son with a mixture of pity and disgust. I watched from the sidelines, invisible yet victorious. I hadn't even had to say anything to him directly. His own insecurity and arrogance had done all the work for me. Lennox had embarrassed himself publicly, and in Dorian's world, that was an unforgivable sin. The gap between father and son was now a canyon. In the days following the birthday disaster, I spent even more time with Dorian. He was genuinely embarrassed by Lennox's behavior and thanked me for my grace in the face of his son's outbursts. We began to develop a bond that felt more real than I had intended, but I didn't let that distract me from my mission. I helped him see the emptiness in Lennox's arrogance, comparing it to the values Dorian had worked so hard to instill in the family name. I talked about how a true leader takes responsibility and how Lennox seemed to be doing the opposite. Dorian sighed, admitting that he had perhaps been too indulgent with his son over the years. I was reinforcing the idea that Lennox was a lost cause, while I was the one who truly understood and respected Dorian's legacy. Lennox's paranoia was at an all-time high. He could see the writing on the wall. He noticed how Dorian listened to me and how I was being invited to private family meetings that he was excluded from. He tried to stage accidental run-ins with me to intimidate me, but I just smiled and kept walking. He was losing control, and he knew it. Isolde was also becoming more frantic. She had expected to be the queen of the family by now, but she was being treated like an afterthought. She and Lennox were fighting constantly, their perfect relationship crumbling under the weight of Dorian's disapproval and Lennox's financial stress. Everything was falling into place. The strategic alliances I had made with the staff and the quiet moves I had orchestrated were paying off. The time had come to finalize the legal side of my plan. I arranged a secret meeting with Dorian's most trusted lawyer, a man who had seen the family's darkest secrets and had no love for Lennox's entitlement. I framed the meeting as a way to protect Dorian's interests, given the recent instability Lennox had caused. During the meeting, I confirmed what I had suspected. If I were to marry Dorian, I would legally have a say in the management of the family's trusts, including the oversight of the allowances paid out to family members. The lawyer explained that Dorian was already considering restructuring the trusts to limit Lennox's access to funds, and as his wife, I would be the natural choice to help manage those changes. I was one step away from total victory. I had the emotional support of the patriarch and the legal path to control the purse strings. All I needed was for Dorian to make the move I had been subtly guiding him toward for months. I wasn't just getting revenge, I was taking over the very system that had tried to discard me. I felt a sense of calm as I left the lawyer's office. The underdog was about to become the matriarch. Lennox had thought he could erase me, but he had actually provided me with the motivation to take everything he valued. The plan was no longer just a dream, it was an impending reality. Lennox's arrogance finally reached its tipping point at a high-stakes charity gala. He had been drinking throughout the event and was clearly agitated by the way the other guests were greeting me with respect. When he saw me talking to one of the city's most influential donors, he lost what little restraint he had left. He stormed over and insulted me directly, calling me a gold digger and a fraud in front of everyone. I didn't lose my cool. I just smiled calmly and looked at him with pity. "Lennox, you're making a scene," I said softly. His rage only increased, and he began to shout about how I had tricked his father. What he didn't realize was that Dorian was standing just a few feet away, documenting the entire outburst with his eyes. I saw Dorian's face harden as he realized just how irresponsible and out of control his son had become. Dorian stepped forward and quietly told Lennox to leave the event. The humiliation for Lennox was total. He had tried to tear me down, but he had only succeeded in proving my point to his father. Dorian turned to me and apologized, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. I knew in that moment that Lennox had finally crossed a line he couldn't come back from. I made sure the details of Lennox's behavior were shared with the right people. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply ensuring that the consequences of his actions were fully realized. Dorian began to openly question whether Lennox was fit to carry the family name, let alone manage any part of the estate. The man who once flaunted his superiority was now being viewed as a liability by his own father. I decided it was time to address Isolde's role in this. She had been spreading lies about my character for months, trying to justify why Lennox had left me for her. I arranged for some of the evidence of her lies, recorded conversations and emails where she had plotted to ruin my reputation, to surface at a major press event she was hosting. The fallout was spectacular. The media, which had once praised her as the new face of the elite, began to question her integrity. The family was shocked, and whispers started circulating through the social circles. Maybe Imrin was never the problem. Isolde's carefully constructed image was shattered, and she was seen for what she truly was, a manipulator who had used her wealth to bully others. Lennox tried to defend her, but his own credibility was so low that no one listened. The perfect couple was now the subject of scandal and ridicule. I watched as their supporters began to distance themselves. People who had once ignored me were now reaching out, trying to get back on my good side. I felt a sense of vindication, but I didn't let it go to my head. I remained focused on the final goal. Isolde and Lennox were already losing the social war. Now it was time to win the financial one. The millionaire heiress was finding out that money can't buy respect, and Lennox was finding out that his new life was built on a very shaky foundation. I decided to face Lennox one-on-one for the first time since the divorce. I found him in the library of the estate, looking disheveled and desperate. He started to yell as soon as he saw me, but I held up a hand to quiet him. My voice was calm and pointed. "Lennox, you've spent so much time trying to replace me that you didn't notice you were losing yourself," I said. He sneered, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I gave him a final warning. "You're about to lose control of what you think you own. You thought I was someone you could just discard, but you forgot that I know where all the bodies are buried." His confusion and anger were palpable, but he didn't have a comeback. He was realizing, too late, that I wasn't the weak person he had married. I left him there, stewing in his own rage. I had given him a chance to walk away with some dignity, but I knew he wouldn't take it. He was too proud and too stubborn to admit he had lost. But that was fine with me. His refusal to back down only made my final victory more certain. As I walked away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had confronted my past and held my ground. I was no longer afraid of Lennox or his family. I was the one in control now, and the final move was already in motion. The moment I had been working toward finally arrived at a small, private family gathering. Dorian stood up to give a toast, but instead of talking about business, he turned to me. In front of Lennox, Isolde, and their closest associates, Dorian proposed. He spoke about finding someone who truly understood the value of the family name and someone he could trust with his legacy. Lennox's jaw dropped and the room froze. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. Isolde turned pale, her eyes darting between Dorian and me. I accepted the proposal with a graceful and dignified smile. I was no longer the discarded ex-wife. I was the future matriarch of the family. The power shift was instantaneous. The guests, sensing the change in the air, immediately began to congratulate us. Lennox tried to speak, but Dorian silenced him with a single look. I was now untouchable. The man who had tried to erase me was now forced to call me his stepmother. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Lennox had replaced me with an heiress to gain status, but I had married his father to gain everything. I had played their game and won. As the celebration continued, I looked at Lennox and saw the realization of his defeat in his eyes. He had lost his father, his status, and soon he would lose even more. As soon as the marriage was official, Dorian and I sat down to discuss the family's finances. He had already decided to make some changes, but with my encouragement, he went further. He revoked Lennox's allowance quietly but completely. No more unlimited credit cards, no more funded penthouses, and no more investment money for his failed projects. The man who once flaunted wealth and power became financially dependent overnight. Lennox was forced to reckon with his own failures. Without Dorian's money, he had nothing. He couldn't afford the lifestyle Isolde expected, and he certainly couldn't afford to pay back the debts he had hidden. He came to the estate to beg Dorian for a loan, but Dorian refused to even see him. I was the one who met him at the door. I handed him a small envelope with a list of job openings in the city. "Since you're so talented, I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding work," I said calmly. Lennox was speechless. He had been stripped of his arrogance and left with the wreckage of his own making. He was no longer the heir to an empire. He was just a man who had made a series of very bad bets. Justice was finally being delivered, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet snip of a financial cord. The fallout from the allowance cut was immediate. Lennox and Isolde's partnership began to crumble almost instantly. Without the money to fund their lavish lifestyle, the love that had brought them together vanished. They fought over everything: who was to blame for the financial mess, how they would maintain their image, and who would pay the bills. Secrets began to surface as they turned on each other. Isolde's family, seeing the scandal and the loss of the Dorian connection, began to distance themselves from her. The family's advisors, who had once catered to Lennox's every whim, now questioned his loyalty and competence. The foundation of the family's social standing was shaking. Every move I had made over the past months had paid off elegantly. I had dismantled their lives without ever having to raise my voice or resort to their level of pettiness. I had simply used their own weaknesses against them. The chaos they were experiencing was the natural result of their own arrogance and greed. I watched from the safety of my new life as their world fell apart. I felt no pity for them. They had shown me none when they were at the top, and they deserved none now that they were at the bottom. The perfect couple was now a cautionary tale of what happens when you build a life on lies and betrayal. A few weeks later, I stood in Dorian's study, reflecting on my journey. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old books and success. I looked at the documents on the desk. My name was now on the titles and the trusts. I hadn't stooped to cruelty. I had executed my plan with precision, dignity, and strategy. I thought about how far I had come from that ballroom where I was an invisible guest. The family had underestimated me, and now they were watching in disbelief as I managed the empire with more skill than Lennox ever had. I had reclaimed my dignity and my place in the world, not by asking for it, but by taking it. Dorian walked in and placed a hand on my shoulder. He told me how much he appreciated my steady hand in navigating the recent family troubles. He saw me as a partner, someone who brought balance and wisdom to his life. I had earned his respect, and in doing so, I had secured my own future. I felt a deep sense of peace. My revenge was complete, but it didn't leave me feeling empty. Instead, it left me feeling powerful. I had proven that success and grace are the ultimate weapons against those who try to tear you down. I was no longer defined by what Lennox had done to me. I was defined by what I had done for myself. Lennox made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. He tried to manipulate Dorian by making up lies about my true intentions, claiming I was only after the money. He even tried to use some old, out-of-context messages from our marriage to make me look bad. But his credibility was long gone. Dorian, now fully wise to his son's recklessness and dishonesty, sided with me at every turn. He told Lennox that he was no longer welcome at the estate until he could show some real maturity and responsibility. Lennox's last card had been played, and it was a losing one. He left the estate for the final time, looking broken and small. Isolde had already moved on, looking for the next wealthy man to fund her life, leaving Lennox to face the wreckage alone. He had lost everything: his family, his money, and his pride. I watched him go, not with anger, but with a quiet satisfaction. He had brought this on himself by underestimating the woman he thought was not enough. He had learned the hard way that you should never underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose. My victory was total, and I was ready to move on into my new life without looking back. Today, I celebrate a quiet life of power and respect. I am the matriarch of the family empire, and I lead with a grace and intelligence that the family has never seen before. Lennox and Isolde are left to navigate the wreckage of their own making, a reminder to everyone of the cost of arrogance. My revenge was never about being cruel. It was about reclaiming what was mine. It was about proving that I was a force to be reckoned with. Through strategy, patience, and unwavering self-respect, I turned a moment of humiliation into a lifetime of triumph. I look at the life I've built with Dorian and the impact we're making through our work. I am no longer the victim of someone else's story. I am the author of my own. I have found emotional freedom and recognition, and most importantly, I have found myself. The ultimate revenge, I've learned, is not just seeing your enemies fall. It's standing tall while they do. I reclaimed my dignity, and in the process, I found a life that is more than enough. I am Imrin, and this is my victory.